This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
You guys can hear me okay? Awesome, very cool. Yeah, so I just recently joined Florida State. How many Gator fans do we have here? Tough year for you guys, huh? Yeah. It's been going great for us, I have to say. So I wouldn't talk about it otherwise, but it's an honor to be here. Last time I was here lecturing, I believe it was 2017 or 18, talking about type 1 diabetes and nutrition. So it's quite the honor to be back to speak with you guys here today on a slightly different topic. It's also revolved in nutrition, but more on the performance realm. So the lecture is going to be about the impact of diet, specifically carbohydrates in sports performance, and testing what we call the central tenets of high carbohydrate performance. These are my disclosures. So many of you have probably heard that carbohydrates are important for performance, maybe even heard they're essential for performance. And maybe I've heard of many or seen many articles, particularly some of the athletes I actually got to speak to earlier today, of some of the carbohydrate recommendations during exercise, upwards of what used to be gold standard, around 60 grams of carbohydrates during, let's say, a long bike ride or a run in a competition setting, up to 120. Well, some athletes are articles coming out of athletes going as high as 200 grams per hour. And there have been articles that have also said, well, look, the absence of carbohydrate or a diet called a ketogenic diet, which is a low carbohydrate diet, could impair performance. So where does this come from? What's the history behind this philosophy of sports nutrition and some of the research we've done on that? So the overview of today's talk is going to first start with the history. Where do we get to where we are today when it comes to sports nutrition? Then talk about some of the central key tenets for why we believe carbohydrates may or may not improve performance. Talk about some of the emergent evidence, actually testing some of those key hypotheses. And then some practical take-homes. Like anyone who might be in a lecture like this, you may wonder, how does this apply to me, or does this apply at all? So I'm going to dial back the clock almost a century, going back to the Olympic Games in 1936, the Berlin Games. Many of you may be familiar with this, not around sports or nutrition, but more so because of the contentious time of the war between Germany and the European or UK and America. But obviously a key part of this time was also the discourse or the time of the games and the impact the athletes and their performance had in relation to how the country's pride, their performance at this contentious time. And of course, a key part of that for these athletes at this time was nutrition. What were they eating? Because we do know that nutrition plays a critical role in performance. And there was a really cool article that talks about the history of nutrition all the way back to 1896. And what this essentially showed is when looking at the historical context of various diets over time, particularly Olympic athletes, and why we care about Olympic athletes is because Olympic athletes are, of course, at the pinnacle of sport in the world, across the world, competing at the highest level against the best athletes the world has to offer. And at that time, the diet was described as consuming upwards of, for some athletes, 800 grams of protein per day. Also, a diet mostly focused on protein, but also higher fat diet. So not necessarily a ketogenic diet per se, but a diet focused much more around protein-centric and fat-centric nutrition. But let's actually come all the way to present time. So in current day guidelines revolving sports performance or elite level performance, it's often recommended, here we have the position from the American Academy of Dietetics, from dietitians in Canada, and ACSM, which is the American Sports Nutrition group that also works with nutrition and athletic performance in the exercise context. And then other community groups or the ISSM or ISSN, Society of Sports Nutrition, they've all come to a similar conclusion, which is in present time, the guidelines are that you want to consume somewhere between 5 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram per day. Now, if you may be wondering, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for, equation? Well, I'm around 230 pounds. I'm a little over 100 kilograms. For someone like me, or let's just say take an average body weight male, that would equate to roughly around 415 to over 1,000 grams of carbohydrates recommended per day if you were one of these athletes that were engaging in a high level of physical activity, multiple hours per day. Let's say you competed in some type of endurance sport. That's a tremendous amount of carbohydrates. 1,000, almost 1,100 is a remarkable amount. So how did we get to the point where in sports nutrition, the gold standard was more focused around protein and fat, and then shifted to a higher carbohydrate approach or recommendation by most of the major sports nutrition community? Well, we're going to go back again in history to 1920s. Scientifically, at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of research on sports performance and nutrition. But there was some literature that people were unfamiliar with. There was a really prominent journal called the Journal of American Medical Association. And in 1925 and 1926, two physicians at Harvard were very curious as to why athletes were getting to the finish line of the Boston Marathon pale in the face, slurred speech, unable to really articulate their words. And what they found at the time was that these athletes were actually observing something called hypoglycemia, something that was historically only seen in patients with a diagnosis I actually have, which is type 1 diabetes, where blood sugar would go low to the point where you would not have enough glucose for the brain. And that would deprive the brain of energy, and then you wouldn't be able to communicate, you'd become pale. Well, this was actually happening in athletes. The very next year, what they discovered was that they took the blood of these athletes and they saw in the blood that glucose levels were low. It wasn't that there was an abundance of something in the blood that was causing a problem. It was the absence of glucose in the blood that was causing a problem, or so it seemed. So then what they did the following year is that they administered carbohydrates. That's a logical conclusion, right? Glucose is low in the blood, give something to increase glucose levels. Well, lo and behold, every single one of the athletes improved their performance. Maybe not a ton, but marginally. It was a year separated, but nonetheless, it gave this first initial study that most people are unfamiliar with over 100 years ago, that carbohydrates, maybe it does improve performance. But that actually didn't change the guidelines. Remember that the Olympic Games were predominant in protein and fat up to the 1960s or late 1960s. So what changed it? It wasn't that initial study. That was actually the first time I'm familiar with in the literature they showed an improvement with carbohydrates in the diet. But it was actually more so at this time in the 1960s, where another prominent researcher was actually able to develop a technique where they could actually take a needle and actually extract muscle tissue for the first time and analyze what was in that muscle. And when they did that, they found that, oh, lo and behold, there's glucose in this muscle, stored glucose in this muscle in the form of what we call glycogen. Glycogen is a way of storing glucose in different compartments in the body, but in the muscle, it seemed logical. This tissue is used for performance. But if it's stored there, it must be essential as a fuel for the muscle. So they did an analysis after that point and found, well, you know what? That might be true. There was a clear association when they provided carbohydrates in the diet between the amount of glycogen in the muscle. But that glycogen was also associated with performance outcomes, so what they call the onset of fatigue. And so then this really led to this phenomenon that muscle glycogen must be essential for performance. Well, that was reinforced in the 1980s, so 20 years later, when they did the same thing, but a new technique came out where you could actually measure the amount of oxygen that goes in your body and the amount of carbon dioxide you breathe out. So everyone in this room is breathing in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. But the ratio of oxygen consumed to CO2 expelled, you breathe out, that ratio tells you how much your body is actually burning carbohydrates versus fat in the body at the whole body level. Well, what they found in this study is when they were first able to understand that, is that when they provided carbohydrates, that the amount of carbohydrates burned, logically, goes up. But they were also able to delay the onset of fatigue as well. So there was this association, yet again, between a measurement of how much carbohydrates you're utilizing and then a performance outcome. Then, in the 1990s, a really important assessment came out. They kind of took all these different studies and built this model. So this idea of looking at all the data together and said, you know what, it seems pretty clear that when we use these technologies developed in the 1980s originally and forward, that when athletes are walking, you probably have heard this before, if you're walking, it's really fat predominant. It's a low intensity exercise, so you're using fat mostly. But as you increase your exercise intensity, you use more and more carbohydrates. And in fact, to the point where it was believed that as you increase your exercise intensity, or called aerobic power, percentage of your total exercise capacity. So imagine going from a subtle walk to a run, to a really fast-paced run where you can't really talk, to a sprint. That's along this spectrum here. Well, as you went higher and higher in that intensity, it appeared, based on this model, that you would essentially require, it would be essential to utilize carbohydrates for that fuel, to fuel that exercise. And that fat would be utilized less and less and less as the exercise intensity decreased. And that really became, and is still a predominant theory in the concept of exercise in nutrition. It's called the crossover point. This point at which the amount of carbohydrates burned crosses over with fat and you switch your primary fuel substrate from one fuel to the other. Then there was these really highlighted studies from a very prominent research group from 2017 to 2020. And what they showed, which reinforced what was being shown before, is that in 2017, they put athletes, high-level elite athletes, Olympic athletes, on a ketogenic diet for 3 weeks. And what these authors showed in the article is they said, well, look, we're going to do some analysis of these athletes and just kind of look at what we call exercise economy, kind of a measure of how efficient you are during exercise. And what they said is, well, when these athletes are on a ketogenic diet, so a low carbohydrate diet, what happens if you take away carbohydrates if we think they're important? Well, you'd think they'd impair performance. Well, what they showed is, well, look, it actually impairs exercise economy, so the efficiency of exercise. So that again is reinforcing this concept of carbohydrates are important. Well, then in 2020, the same research group did a 5 to 6 day ketogenic diet, and again showed the same phenomenon, impaired economy, and then an actual measure of performance. So they actually looked at performance and showed that it went down 2% when you remove carbohydrates. Now, for most people, you'll never detect that difference, but for them, they claim this was a very prominent effect because the difference between first and second place in an Olympic level trial is definitely less than 2%. And they showed the same thing yet again with a 3-week ketogenic diet. So the concept continued to be reinforced that, look, all these concepts come together to believe that carbohydrates have important effects on the body related to performance, but look, you take them away and they impair performance. And this led to the central tenets of current sports nutrition and high carbohydrate diets, which is that one, lower carbohydrate intake, at least for less than 3 weeks in duration, may lead to what appears to be marginal reductions in performance around 2%. There was also this model built on prior data that there's this important phenomenon called the crossover effect, and you need carbohydrates to do high intensity exercise. Carbohydrates increase, if you consume them, the amount you burn, and that was associated with performance, but so was glycogen. And all the way back to 1920s, just giving carbohydrates appear to improve performance in athletes. So these are the central tenets of what has led to our current guidelines today in sports nutrition. There's a problem, though. There's one major problem, or maybe multiple major problems in these studies. And that's the major limitations we're going to talk about. The first of which is that these prominent studies that were done between 2017, actually very well done studies, 2017 to 2020, they all were less than 4 weeks in duration. And you may ask the question, why does that matter at all? Why do we care that it's less than 4 weeks in duration? Well, there have been studies back to the 1960s and 1980s that appeared to show that as you go on either a fast or a ketogenic diet, that you don't normalize your metabolism until after 3 weeks. There are still changes that are occurring. The body's not at a plateau state yet. So there's clearly adaptation still happening to these dietary changes that exceed 3 weeks in duration. So it's absolutely possible these athletes are still under an adaptation window. They haven't actually fully switched to this new diet they're consuming. But we don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. We also have this major assumption in the crossover concept that is based on a model system of prior studies that were limited to high carbohydrate settings. The problem is that this has never actually been assessed for its ability to test it at very high intensities. What is the amount of fat and carbohydrates exercised at its high intensities when you actually do interventions to improve fat oxidation? And is that associated with performance? One of the most important limitations of sports nutrition guidelines around high carbohydrate diets is that all of these associations between the amount of carbohydrates you're oxidizing during sports performance and glycogen levels are all what we call associations. They were never what we like to think of as kind of a gold standard, a way of understanding that A causes B, which is called causal effect. So if you do something, you cause an effect and it immediately causes the A to B effect, that's a causal relationship. But what if there's an A, B, C step, and A and C change together, but we don't know if A is causing C, maybe it's B causing C, or something else is happening. We don't know because it's not a direct effect. It's always just a relationship. But there's one problem with these studies that all showed this relationship. Every single one of these analyses that showed an impact of carbohydrates on performance, all of them also measure something else, which is blood glucose levels. And every single one of those analyses where carbohydrates improve performance, the group that didn't have carbohydrates got hypoglycemia, which is a major confounder for making the direct association between carbohydrate oxidation and glycogen as a causal factors in performance. That's a huge limitation in predicting if carbohydrates do directly impact performance, at least through these measures. And there's this growing belief in the sports community that more is better. But the problem is that more is better hasn't actually been studied. Meaning, should you have 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour or 120? In fact, some went up to 200, and they're claiming these are improving their performance. The problem is that when you actually look at studies where they did this, which is a limited number of studies, as you can see highlighted here in one of the prominent researchers in sports nutrition over the last 30 years, openly acknowledge there's a lack of research on this to actually prove a relationship between more carbohydrates and better performance. In fact, most of the studies don't show a relationship, at least the ones that have been done. That's a major limitation in this belief around more carbohydrates is better in sports performance. But these are all testable hypotheses. So in science, when you want to answer an important question, you try to do everything you can to control all the confounding variables, things that could interact with your effect, that could maybe cause an association, but there was this other factor over here that was actually interacting with it. And so how do we do that? By removing those factors. Well, and this begs the question, are current high-carb sports nutrition guidelines correct? Well, how do you test these factors, these different paradigms of the central tenets of high-carbohydrate nutrition and sports performance, and also understanding there's clear limitations here. But what's the evidence around these limitations? Well, we tried to answer those exact questions over the last 3 to 4 years. In the first analysis, what we wanted to do is we took 10 middle-aged male runners. Okay, these were individuals who were running at least 50 kilometers per week. They were around, on average, around 10 to 12% body fat. They were very high VO2 maxes, so very fit athletes. We brought them in and we asked them, hey, there's a belief that carbohydrates are essential for high-intensity performance. So we're going to ask you guys to do 2 separate diets, okay? We're going to ask them to do a high-carbohydrate diet and a very low-carbohydrate diet. But this time, we're going to do it for 4 weeks. We're going to have them go over 3 weeks in duration to at least get to that time point of over the 3-week threshold. And we're going to keep key variables controlled to remove the possibility that they could impact our outcomes. Because what we really wanted to test is if you shift from high to low carbohydrate, not the calories, not the activity you're doing, not the body changes that have along with it. If you just change the fat with the carbohydrate ratio, is that able to impact performance? So that's what we did. We controlled those, and we also added in some key measurements of monitoring to ensure they actually did the diet. And many of the prior studies that have shown these negative impacts, they didn't have these same controls. And we wanted to test this in a very high intense setting. We're gonna ask them to run 1 mile. You may say, okay, well, that's not very intense. A 1 mile time trial is one of the most intense efforts in sports. It is grueling enough to where if you give it all your effort, like going more than 30 seconds of that is very difficult. It's a brutal effort. But they're often doing this for 4 or 5 minutes. It's a very, very tough, very high intense duration form of exercise. But we also are going to ask them to do 6 by 800 meter sprints. Okay, 2 different forms of very still anaerobic-ish in nature. Okay, it's still using both fuel substrates, but high enough in intensity where fat oxidation should hypothetically be 0. So if you did a ketogenic diet and you have to use carbohydrates it must be essential for high intensity performance, then clearly there should be a difference in performance between these 2 efforts. And so these together, both the duration of exercise, the intensity of exercise, allowed us to get at 3 of these central tenets while controlling key variables. So what were the results? When actually controlling the key variables that impact performance and having the athletes go for at least 4 weeks in duration, the same athlete too, so we crossed them over, so we control for genetics and environmental factors, we found that across a high and low carbohydrate diet, that having very low carbohydrates did not impair performance at all in the 1 mile time trial, nor in the 6 by 800 meter sprints. But you ask the question that I think logically would come up is then how were they fueling that performance if they must be using carbohydrates? Well, the problem is no one actually has tested this before in this particular way at this high of an intensity. And what we found is the highest levels of fat oxidation ever reported in the medical literature, which were over on average 1.5 grams per minute, and some athletes exceeding 2 grams of fat burn per minute. An extremely high level of fat burned, if anyone's familiar with relative numbers. It's astronomical comparatively, as you can see the difference here between the red line here post-diet on the low-carb diet, the amount of fat burned, and the low-carb or high-carbohydrate diet on the right. A massive difference in fuel. This is also showing us, these are the numbers, but this is also showing us that this belief that the amount of fat that would be utilized at this time point would be hypothetically 0, but instead, it was at record high levels. So a lot of times we have assumptions, and it's important to then assure that these assumptions are correct by testing them rigorously and appropriately and controlling many of the things that interact with it. And what do we find? Highest levels of fat oxidation and no difference in performance, going completely against what we'd expect from sports nutrition guidelines and many of the foundational evidence leading to that. But what was most surprising to us is we actually tested the glycemic control in these athletes, not using a single time point. So many of you here have probably gotten blood work before, and you go get tested for maybe a fasting glucose value or a measure of your average glucose over 2 to 3 months called HbA1c. Now, these are different ways of testing if you're at risk for something like prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. Well, instead of taking a single time point, maybe once every 3 to 6 months, we actually put a monitor on that would give us a measure of their glucose levels every 5 minutes for 24 hours for 4 weeks straight on both diets. So an extremely high level of resolution. And these athletes, 30% of these athletes on the high carbohydrate diet, fit, low body fat, high VO2 maxes, exercising over 50 kilometers per week, 30% of them only on the high carb diet had glucose levels consistent with prediabetes. Only when they were being measured with this assessment. They were unaware of this. And one of the questions that come up is, well, that might be elevated over 24 hours because we could say 24 hours. We also look at the fasting window. And you can clearly see in the fasting window in these 3 athletes that the high carb, and these athletes weren't heavier. There was no reason for body weight differences why these athletes were particularly vulnerable, but they did have signs consistent with prediabetes. And the threshold here in the fasted state would be 100. And as you can see, the entire time they're well above this threshold. This is the average over a 4-week window, not a single time point. And as you can see, what was remarkable is that not only did every athlete improve their glycemic control on this diet, but particularly the athletes that had glucose levels consistent with prediabetes, a remarkable improvement in their glycemic control. This also introduced a phenomenon. This was shocking to me. You would never expect an athlete, they're what you consider immune or vulnerable to health issues. But there's actually been a growing paradigm in sports nutrition called the fit but unhealthy athlete. It's an understanding that some athletes, their level of training load and stress, et cetera, but also the push for very high glycolytic and high volumes of carbohydrates, particularly not only throughout the entire day, but at exercise as well, maybe putting athletes at risk for actually being unhealthy. And we were seeing a signal of that in these athletes. There's actually, I won't show this here, but there's also a world record holder, Lionel Sanders, who won the half Ironman recently this last year. And he publicly came out recently and disclosed that he got diagnosed, a very fit, a record holder, just won the Ironman half world championship, that he also got prediabetes. And he also, by removing some of these highly glycolytic forms of carbohydrates, was able to completely resolve his diabetes rapidly. So this was an important effect because it didn't just show the impact of nutrition on performance, because there was no difference, at least when we tested it this way. But there was also an impact on health, illustrating that this might not just only be about performance, but diet might also, as we know, also have a major impact on health as well. But if we shift back for a second towards performance, one of the things that came out of that original study was, well, hey, and that high intensity exercise, like, okay, maybe they perform the same. But no, there's no way they would perform the same if you did this to a high level endurance athlete that goes for multiple hours in exercise. We say, oh, okay, that's an interesting question. Why don't we actually test it? So what we did is we didn't take the average person off the street to exercise. We actually got Ironman competitors, people who completed Ironmans, who are doing huge volumes of exercise, very, very fit athletes who are actively competing in Ironmans. And what we asked them to do is we asked them to sustain the diet for 6 weeks in duration. We wanted to cross the 3-week threshold, at least 4 weeks in duration, again, to get at that point of getting at least 4 weeks on each diet. We kept the calories consistent. We kept the diet, the calories, activity. We monitored these athletes, again, controlling these key confounding variables. And it was crossovers. So genetics and environment were also key controls that we had in the studies, unlike many of the other studies. But one key critical component is that we asked these athletes during these exercise bouts to anyone heard of hitting the wall, the phenomenon in exercise? We asked them to hit the wall, not once, not twice, but at least 4 times in this study. And amazing athletes that were doing this. We asked them to sustain up to 70% of their total maximal aerobic capacity as long as possible. And we were having athletes going up to 4+ hours doing this until they could no longer sustain 70%, or they got a key measure that we had to stop at, like hypoglycemia. And we also asked them to do this in a state of prolonged fasting, because what we wanted to do is remove the confounder of glycogen as a variable across these 2 dietary diets, or across the 2 diets. And we were also interested because we not only wanted to test across diets, while adapting them for at least 4 weeks, because that time point might be important, and controlling these key variables, but we also wanted to see, hey, what if we just gave a little bit of glucose? Okay, we don't want to give 60 grams per hour, 120 grams per hour, as is believed to be essential to maintain gold standard high-level performance. We're going to give the equivalent of 1 tablespoon every hour of glucose, just 1 tablespoon. And you might ask, well, why just 1 tablespoon? That's why that makes no sense. We gave just enough glucose to maintain blood glucose levels, not enough to change whole body carbohydrate oxidation, not enough to change glycogen, just enough to change the amount of glucose in the blood. Because we wanted to see, was it the glycogen that they are hypothesizing is improving performance? Is it the carbohydrate oxidation? Or is it maybe something else? Maybe it's this other measure that's been confounding all of these prior studies, which is actually the amount of glucose in the blood. So we tested that as well. And we asked them to do it across both diets, 2 time points across both. It was quite an impressive effort here. And what this was getting at by doing both these dietary paradigms is looking at, if you adapt the diet for long enough, is there a difference in performance? What about this effect on carbohydrate oxidation? Is it actually associated with performance? What about glycogen? Is that associated with performance? But then there's also this additional effect of what about this phenomenon of how many carbohydrates do you actually need for performance? Because keep in mind, this is 6 to 12 times lower compared to the gold standard recommendations for carbohydrate fueling and performance. Well, when you did a low carbohydrate diet for 6 weeks in duration and these highly fit Ironman completers and asked them to hit the wall across both diets, dramatically lowering carbohydrates in the diet had no negative impact on performance across these 2 paradigms. When we asked them to hit the wall, same performance across these athletes. This got to the point where if there's no difference in prolonged performance, let me back up for a second. We also know that obviously on these diets that fat oxidation is much higher as well, as shown down here. We don't have the graph here, but it was much higher, just like it was in the other diet, which got to the point of there was no difference in performance. Obviously, if carbohydrate oxidation was not impacting performance because distinct on the diet, it wasn't associated with performance either. And obviously, across diets where you do a low carbohydrate diet, it also reduces muscle glycogen. And we also asked them to do a prolonged fast to ensure that glycogen was reduced. And it had no negative impact on performance. So obviously, it wasn't associated with performance when you tested it when you're controlling the confounding variables. And it showed that again, these central tenets of high carbohydrate fueling in sports nutrition were failing when actually being tested rigorously in this setting. But when we asked the athletes to consume just 1 tablespoon of glucose, so roughly around 10 grams per hour, 3.4 grams every 20 minutes, oftentimes these long duration exercise bouts, athletes are constantly trying to give carbohydrates consistently at intervals throughout the exercise. There was not only an improvement on the high carbohydrate diet with just 10 grams per hour, but also on the low carbohydrate diet, 22% across both diets by just titrating enough glucose in to mitigate hypoglycemia, not to change whole body carbohydrate oxidation or glycogen. So what does that tell us? That tells us that maybe the most important signal in exercise performance isn't glycogen. Maybe it isn't the amount of carbohydrates your body oxidizes during exercise, because it can accommodate by the other fuels. Maybe it's actually the amount of glucose that's circulating in the blood. We talked about that. Now, when looking backwards though, remember these 3 studies. The diets, the exercise bouts that were at least either 5 days to up to 3 weeks in duration, showing either impaired exercise economy or reduction in performance around 2%. But remember what this duration, 5 to 6 days or 3 weeks in duration. One key thing about these studies is when they showed impaired performance, we did something alongside this study that I thought was particularly important, that I didn't realize how important it was until after we did it and looked at the data later, which is that we monitored glucose levels, again, every 5 minutes over 24 hours across the entire duration of both diets for 6 weeks. But we also looked at ketone levels. So the level of amount of ketones, which is a byproduct of fat metabolism. So you go on a ketogenic diet, it's called a ketogenic diet because your body starts producing this molecule called ketones because you're burning more fat. Fat turns into ketones, it fuels the brain. So we see that go up. But what we saw is that when monitoring this consistently over multiple weeks in duration, that when we ask these athletes to control their body weight, their activity, their diet, and calories, and sustain these two diets, that when you monitor these key metabolites that are a key indication of your metabolism, where are you at in your metabolism? Are you shifting? Are you going up? Are you going down? They did not reach what I call metabolic homeostasis, or a plateau, or an adaptation plateau to the diet, to these two key metabolites associated with the diet change until 4 weeks. As you can see, ketones go up, and they don't plateau till after 3 weeks. When we monitor glucose levels every 5 minutes over 6 weeks, again, you see it doesn't plateau till after 4 weeks. Again, reinforcing what has been alluded to for almost a half a century, that it appears not only is it related to performance, that you have to adapt to these diets sufficiently long, but that there are key molecular changes that don't reach normalization after that period of time. Which gets to an important study that recently came out, talking about diets that are short in duration. Studies that look at diets like ketogenic diets often assume that if you do a ketogenic diet for 2 weeks and it impairs performance, sometimes what these authors claim is that they're setting up the diet to fail in these analyses, because it's not sufficiently long to actually test whether the diet is inducing an effect or not if they're still going through an adaptation of the diet. You're actually just looking at the adaptation as it's happening. You're not looking at the effect of the diet after it has changed the physiology of the body completely. Which again gets to the point of this study claim, which is that in the title they say adaptation to a low carbohydrate diet is rapid, but impairs endurance, exercise metabolism, and performance. But that's a false claim, because we know that no study has demonstrated the ability to maintain metabolic homeostasis, nor did they. They just showed a shift, which we know happens quickly, but doesn't normalize till later. So what is the key results and takeaways from these findings? Well, to extend beyond that a little bit more, we know that this crossover effect that has been a part of the exercise paradigm for a long period of time, not only does it appear to not be true in our analysis when you actually show that up to, on a low carbohydrate diet, that very high intensity exercise can be fueled by fat. But there's also another study that has shown something similar, which actually shows that actually many people are actually oxidizing high levels of carbohydrates even at lower levels of intensity. And it's not until you really shift to these low carbohydrate diets you actually see more of this crossover effect that has been modeled in exercise physiology. And the model's different in that way. Some of the core assumptions as well around, okay, more carbohydrates is better during exercise. Well, we showed that only 10 grams improves performance, but do you need 60? Do you need 120? And why would you even need it? Well, in this modeling study, there was a modeling study that had shown, hey, you need up to that many carbohydrates per day. But there's another analysis that just came out that says that up to, that you can sustain marathon world record performance in the absence of 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, which is hypothesized what's essential to do that. In fact, you may be able to do that and maintain world-class performance based on understanding of the amount of fat that you actually oxidize during these diets and maintain world record performance. Again, challenging these core assumptions. And again, there's been a review actually looking not just these studies, but actually a review prior to that. When you only look at the studies that are over 3 weeks in duration, you consistently don't see an impairment in performance. We're actually not the first people to show this. We're just the first people to rigorously assess it through controlling all these key variables and doing at least 4 weeks in duration at the same time. But others have shown something similar if the diet is over 3 weeks in duration. So what is the practical take-home that we saw? Obviously, we saw that when you actually rigorously test the hypothesis revolving core assumptions of high carbohydrate diets, it fails. It fails to actually show that. In fact, I'm not showing this data here, but we recently showed a publication just lowering carbohydrates at the meal right before performance also didn't change performance either. So a lot of these assumptions we have when you actually test them aren't panning out, and it certainly questions, do you need to have these high carbohydrate diets, and there's potentially implications of that for some athletes, particularly this phenomenon of the normal but unhealthy athlete, where even some athletes may be particularly vulnerable to even showing signs of subclinical disease like prediabetes using continuous monitoring. Now, to even go beyond that, one thing that I was very skeptical about is we showed this in our single study in 3 out of 10 athletes. And so you may wonder, okay, well, what if you've just got those 3 people who have some problem with their genetics, or there's some other variable going on? Maybe this is just you guys. What if no one else has shown this before? And that's a really important phenomenon. And so I took every single study that had ever measured the same measure we did, which is this continuous glucose monitoring, in athletes for at least 7 days in duration. And what we saw is that it's not a one-off phenomenon. There's actually a lot of analysis where you look at continuous glucose monitor, because I actually asked the authors for this data, their raw data, and looked at them. There are a number of athletes who are actually running higher glucose levels that are consistent with prediabetes than is ever appreciated before. It's certainly not most athletes, but there's definitely a number of athletes who are seeing this phenomenon. And again, this is Lionel Sanders, the one I was talking about before, who openly disclosed and was honest, which I thought was quite honorable, to disclose his prediabetes and also his journey to come out of that. But there's also other implications here. There's a lot of emergent evidence on ultra-processed foods, okay? And when you talk about the gels and the foods that are consumed, particularly during exercise, they're often all highly processed forms of carbohydrates. Well, we know that these diets, often for the average person, have just consumed compared to an unprocessed diet, can lead to weight gain. I mean, upwards of 2 to 3 plus kilograms, so like 5 to 6 pounds or more, just within a 2-week window of time, if you just gave 2 people 2 choices, either ultra-processed or not. And obviously that has some potential major health implications. In fact, ultra-processed foods just had analysis come out recently showing it's associated with increases in mortality risk as well in some individuals. Association, it's not causal, but it's not a good sign. We also know that in America, there's been multiple large population analyses that have shown that 9 out of 10 of Americans have what we call suboptimal metabolic health. So if we look in this room, 9 out of 10 of us have some measure of suboptimal metabolic health, at least according to multiple publications. That could be an elevated fasted glucose, that could be elevated blood pressure, triglycerides, waistline, whatever it might be. 93% of us in this country have suboptimal metabolic health. And over 68% of Americans now have some form of obesity, adults. Over 20% of children actually have obesity and prediabetes. So there's other implications, because most of the food or highly processed food that people overconsume and are at risk is high carbohydrate forms of food. Carbohydrates aren't necessarily per se the worst thing on earth for all people, but they're clearly something that may put some people at risk, as we've shown in our study. And we talked about these numbers as well. But we know that in our analysis, the ketogenic diet, or these very low carbohydrate diets, not only did it have no negative impact on performance, they performed exactly the same, both in these low, very high intensity, short duration exercise bouts, or these extremely long duration hitting the wall exercise bouts. They performed the same. But it's been known for over 200 years that ketogenic diets could have powerful therapeutic effects. And patients with my disease, diagnosed 200 years ago, the ketogenic diet extended the life of patients with my disease before insulin was even discovered. It was standard of care for diabetes and obesity in the 1800s. It was shown first in 1921 to actually be able to reduce the amount of seizures in patients with epilepsy. Now we see emergent clinical evidence in all sorts of different disorders and diseases that really span a wide spectrum that you think would be unrelated. But at the center of it is this metabolic or metabolism. This metabolism really has this kind of cross impact on so many different conditions and disorders, including the emergent evidence that ketogenic diet in pilot analysis may positively impact individuals with psychiatric diagnoses like depression, bipolar disorder, and even schizophrenia. And as this is brought up, we know that it could prevent and reverse obesity, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and alleviate symptoms of neurological disorders and manage potentially emergent evidence of psychiatric conditions. The question is, a lot of times someone will walk into a clinic and maybe they might consider a ketogenic diet, and oftentimes it's most prevalent in athletes, like, well, I don't want to do that because it'll impair my performance. That's very common in type 1 diabetes community with athletes. But the evidence doesn't support that. So the question is, should athletes forego this diet for its health benefits if it's not impairing performance? Because that's really at the core of the question we had is it actually negatively impacting anything when you reduce the carbohydrates? Because there certainly might be a therapeutic benefit on the other side. So when we look back at this paradigm, some would call it dogmatic belief in sports nutrition that carbohydrates are essential performance, it seems like much of the evidence that has supported that is there. It's definitely there. Carbohydrates, even in our study, just a little bit improve performance. But the question is, it doesn't appear that reducing it in its entirety from a ketogenic diet is going to inherently destroy performance. It also is highly questionable whether someone should be consuming north of 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour when the evidence is not only lacking, but we're showing that just 10 grams appears to have a meaningful effect through maintaining blood glucose levels. So it asks this question of is the ketogenic diet actually impairing performance? And we're just not seeing evidence to support that. So when we test the evidence for these central hypotheses, every single one of them, when tested in a rigorous setting where you control body weight, you control activities, you control the calories, you actually monitor where these athletes are on a diet, and you actually do it in the same athlete to control their genetics and environment, that we fail to support the core tenets of the superiority of high carbohydrate nutrition in sports performance. So what's the take home? Well, for over a century, athletes have been advised to consume carbohydrates for optimal performance. Some athletes being advised, particularly high volume athletes, 600 to over 1,000 grams of carbohydrates an hour. But we know there are limitations to how those recommendations came to be today. And emergent evidence, where we directly and rigorously assess that, failed to confirm the central tenets that support that that you need those type of diets to perform optimally. And at least in our analysis, there's certainly probably more controversial than it should be, but maybe less so nowadays because people appreciate the negative impacts of ultra-processed foods, which are mostly carbohydrate, that there may be consequences. And some people don't realize the consequence because most people in America are on high carbohydrate diets. They often untested for their risk or not doing advanced enough testing to find out if they are in fact at risk on these diets, particularly even those who we thought were most immune to these type of metabolic derangement, which are athletes. And I really want to hit this home because not only have I been a huge advocate for maximizing performance, I've always done high volumes of exercise myself. I also live with a chronic disease, a chronic irreversible disease since childhood. I think health should never be sacrificed at the altar of performance. I heard that by a colleague who's in clinical practice who was actually a sports performance doctor for a lot of major teams. And it really hits hard. You shouldn't be sacrificing your health for performance. And oftentimes I think people are inadvertently not realizing they may be doing that by pushing more and more of these type of paradigms when we don't actually think the evidence may support doing that. And we know that there's these powerful therapeutic effects of some of these diets that may not have a lot of carbohydrates in them. And athletes, at least our evidence seems to suggest they should not fear that it's going to impair their performance when they are pursuing it, maybe for some of their health purposes that are independent of athletic endeavors. So with that, I would like to actually thank Angela Puff, who's here. She's actually someone who looked over me during grad school. I had no idea she was going to be here. She showed up, surprised me. So I was like, I almost couldn't even do this talk, I almost started crying. But I want to thank her. Also, I don't know if he's still here, Ken Ford, he gave me a huge opportunity when I first graduated from USF to go on and pursue science immediately, which was an amazing opportunity and it really changed my life. And many of the other groups that we work with, Boston Children's, Harvard Medicine, and many others, and the funding sources that we've had over the years, otherwise the science wouldn't happen. So for that, thank you for your time, and I'd love to answer any questions you guys have.
questions here? Okay. All right, I see. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Can I toss you this?
How's this work?
Just talking to you.
Talking to it? Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm totally blown away by it, and it kind of fits my own personal style of dieting. I did have a question. It sounds like your science is very conclusive. How much of the sports world is beginning to adapt your science to their methodology?
Truthfully, I think so both of those articles that I talked about, those are just examples. We actually recently have a review that's coming out that reviewed over 100 years of evidence, over 160 trials in exercise performance and metabolism, and multiple analysis within one review, and that should be coming out soon. So I didn't talk about it here. I used the examples of some of the key studies that kind of illustrate the point. Both of those articles were so, I think, counterintuitive to the exercise science world that they were actually trending on PubMed, meaning they were one of the most viewed articles across all science literature that was out and being published at the time. I had friends from high school who in run clubs who I'd never heard from in 20 years reach out to me. I think it's reaching people, but I think rightfully so, people are apprehensive to just say, oh, okay, we've been told this for 40 years. We're just going to undo that and walk away from it. I don't think that's going to happen. Also keep in mind when it comes to elite level performance or athletes, they're usually the ones that people look at to guide, what should I do? You know, people look at the LeBron Jameses of the world or the best in the world, Usain Bolts, they're looking at what these guys are doing to predict what should I do, because they're the best, I want to be the best too, or like try to be the best. But I think there's an error in that, you know, well, I might be a little bit on a tangent here. I'll get direct to your question and just say, I think it's slow, but it's very clear that there is a lot of interest. And also, people, when this first came out with a 30% for showing glucose levels consistent with pre-diabetes, they didn't believe us, or believe the data, not us, but like the data. But then I couldn't tell you the amount of physicians and individual athletes reach out to me and say, hey, I see a lot of people in my clinic like that. And that was actually mind-blowing to me. I did not expect that to even come out of our findings. And then I was having doctors and athletes reach out to me like, that's happening to me too. And I appreciate you sharing that. I didn't realize that was the case. And so I think it's growing in awareness. I certainly don't think the nutrition guidelines are going to magically flip over and change anytime soon, but I think it's important, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here to bring awareness to some of the emergent evidence, because at least from a health perspective, we're on a trajectory that's incredibly alarming. And diet, a recent analysis looking at, I think, over 30 different countries using super advanced methods, some of the best research groups in the world, looked at the impact of diet and exercise. Like, okay, which is predicting the obesity epidemic? The lack of exercise, is it nutrition? Diet predicted over 90% of the obesity epidemic across the 36 different groups in geographical regions. So nutrition is center to one of the biggest issues we have, at least in overall health, which is the growing obesity epidemic, which is also leading to this overwhelming effect on suboptimal metabolic health, not just in America, but growing across the world. And so I think it's time to really reassess much of this, not just for performance reasons, but for health reasons as well, because some of these diets are incredibly powerful for preventing and reversing some of those conditions that we see happening at record rates in America. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Excellent work. You know, challenging these kinds of assumptions is one of the most important things that scientists can do, but people are not always brave enough to do it. So very proud of you. Excellent work. My question is about the metabolic homeostasis point that you saw. So these are elite athletes. I would assume at baseline probably more metabolically flexible than the average person. So do you think the metabolic homeostasis point would be the same for an average person perhaps living a sedentary lifestyle? And then my follow-up question is, when we think about potential health benefits for these other conditions, health conditions outside of athletic performance, we know that a lot of those benefits are related to signaling, perhaps epigenetic changes that occur with that shift in metabolism that's downstream. Do you think that that 4-week point would also be a homeostatic point for those mechanisms that are happening at the cellular level?
So that was from Dr. Angela Puff. She changed my life. So a great question. I don't think it would be the same. I think that individuals who aren't athletes, so we controlled so many things that you would think would make the adaptation quicker. And we saw it at 4 weeks when the plateau happened. So I would fully suspect that someone who doesn't have that type of rapid adaptation potential it would be a little bit longer. Because both those studies were in athlete groups. They were both in, it wasn't in an average community. It was athletes who were competing in either national or state or national level, either run or Ironman competitions. You know, the other question is obviously very, very important, but I'll answer that more in a broad stroke because I don't know when the epigenetic changes would be fully actualized. I mean, I would think that some of those you'd see signs of that almost immediately. Like when you switch to a low carbohydrate diet, we know that glucose, insulin, and ketone levels, we all start to see those shifts within 18 hours, but the full effect is not fully realized. And I think the way I would love to answer that question is to say that actually, I don't even think the athletes I think there are some signals that we know extend even beyond 4 weeks. We think we capture the ones that were essential to exercise performance within the 4-week window, but there are things that go beyond 4 weeks in duration and adaptation. One of those might be glycogen normalization. There have been a lot of studies that have never directly assessed what they call longitudinal over time effect of the low glycogen effect of low carbohydrate diets and when it normalizes again. We do know it normalizes, but we don't know what the timeline is. And almost every study less than 12 weeks in durations in athletes has always showed a deficiency in glycogen, and that's up to 3 months. That's, you know, over twofold longer than what we were looking at. So another question that's been brought up to us is, what if you adapted them for even longer? Would you have started to shift towards an improvement in performance maybe? Because you can potentially burn or utilize more substrate in the form of fat. We don't even know. But yeah, so thank you. Or here it is, yep.
Right here. The liver is a major storage site for glycogen. What is the effect of exercise and diet on the storage and release of glucose from the liver?
I think the effect of glycogen in the liver is completely underappreciated in exercise performance, and our upcoming paper, I think, is making a very strong case, I believe, that it is essential. When you lower carbohydrates, we know that it can lower glycogen levels, and we also know that even short-term carbohydrate restriction or caloric restriction would also lower glycogen levels in the liver pretty quickly. But the difference between the liver and the muscle is that the liver can release glucose from it, whereas the muscle can't. And so the body seems to do everything it can to maintain as much as it can liver glycogen levels. We see that liver glycogen normalizes quicker post a ketogenic diet. At least there's some biopsy-based analysis that suggests that. Whereas muscle, all the analysis seem to say it might be a bit more prolonged. But I think that a lot of that comes down to the central nature of liver glycogen being able to maintain blood glucose levels. Because, as you probably appreciate while you asked this question, blood glucose levels are essential to life. They're in this really tight range. I think you have around 1 teaspoon of glucose circulating in your blood at all times. But if it goes slightly below the normal range, let's say around 70 to 180 is a low threshold, milligrams per deciliter, you start getting symptoms called hypoglycemia, shaky, irritable, reduction in cognition. You go above that level, at least high enough, you can start to see impairments and you start to get irritable, fatigued, you see changes in how the body metabolizes carbohydrates at these levels. So the body wants to keep it very, very tight. And the only way it can do that in the absence of nutrition, like let's say you go through feast and famine. The only time you can maintain that during a famine is to be able to mobilize that, at least acutely, with liver glycogen level or liver glycogen release. Long term, you have to start breaking down other components of the body to maintain it. And then ultimately, probably the most essential thing to maintaining life long term in the absence of nutrition is to be able to produce or switch over to fat-based metabolism and be able to produce ketone bodies, which allow the brain to thrive or maintain cognition in the absence of exogenous glucose. So I don't know if I got directly at your question, but I think to your question, liver is essential, super important. It stores it. It seems that it adapts a bit more as a priority, maybe quicker, at least the evidence I've seen, but I'm making some assumptions based on emergent information I'm aware of. I don't know if anyone's actually directly tested that over time, because you have to eat a liver biopsy, and no one's volunteering for that study. So,
Okay. How is the one teaspoon of sugar sufficient to maintain blood glucose for someone who's exercising at a really high level?
So initially, when you look at historical studies, the way we try to answer that question, you have to look at what the body is burning during exercise. So what we see is that the body is utilizing both carbohydrates and fat together. So it's obviously pulling it from other parts of the body, the stored glycogen in the muscle, and to a degree it starts oxidizing it from other areas. Eventually it oxidizes it from the blood as well. That's why you do get eventually hypoglycemia. But what's also interesting in that literature as well is that when you give high carbohydrate during exercise, you see that you don't actually increase total energy output. You just shift what you're using for fuel. So some of this work was actually done by a gentleman named Tim Noakes, who's like a really well-known scientist in sports nutrition years back, but a number of people have done this as well, essentially showing that if you give more carbohydrates, you're not necessarily improving your metabolic output, you're just shifting what fuel you're using. And the reason that happens is because when you give a high amount of carbohydrates, you have this spike in insulin. I'm sure you guys have heard, high carbohydrate diets, insulin, or something involving insulin resistance. When carbohydrates, you consume them and glucose goes up in the blood, insulin goes up to control it into normal range. That's like your thermostat for blood glucose is your insulin levels. The thing about insulin is it's infinitely more potent at the fat cell than it is the muscle. So what happens is when insulin goes up quickly, it binds the fat cell predominantly and shuts down the ability, or at least dramatically reduces the ability to break down fat. It's a fat storage hormone. So when it gets to the fat, it blunts its ability to break down. So what happens is when people think that they're actually consuming carbohydrates, one of the reasons they believe they're doing that is to, hey, I want to prevent my muscle glycogen from breaking down, so I'm going to consume it during exercise so that at the end of the race, I'll have muscle glycogen to sprint. In reality, it's the opposite. It's a paradox. When you consume high carbohydrate intake prior to exercise, you paradoxically break down muscle glycogen because you're blocking the fat as a fuel substrate, and it starts taking it from the muscle. So to your original question, it appears that it's actually coming predominantly from the muscle. You obviously have the liver that's helping repopulate the blood glucose is being oxidized as well. So it's both of them, but you have the liver maintaining the blood and the muscle is being broken down as well. But eventually the glycogen becomes depleted. You become predominantly reliant on the blood glucose levels, but the liver already gave as much glucose as it can and it starts to drop in blood glucose levels. And at that point, your body is essentially telling you to shut down. Like, don't continue to exercise because this is going to be dangerous and life-threatening to our ability to even maintain normal glucose levels. So I don't know if that got directly to your question, kind of a roundabout way, but yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Years ago, when the Atkins diet came out, one of the problems with it is that long-term people were having kidney stones because they had too much protein and not enough carbs. And I'm sure you didn't see that problem in only 6 weeks or 10 weeks, but is that going to be an issue going long-term for some of these athletes if they decide to do more protein and less carbs?
So there have been a number of analysis, large-scale analysis, looking at the impact of. So the best way to analyze this question is to look at the most rigorous evidence we have, which is what they call meta-analysis. So studies of multiple other studies. You take as many studies together, because what if Andrew did a study and John did a study that showed the exact opposite? So you take as many of the studies together and look at the average outcome from those studies. And what they have consistently recently shown is that there was a belief that high carbohydrate diets could cause a negative effect on the kidneys. But when you actually look at the evidence, it appears that it not only, it does not have any negative impact with high protein diets on the kidneys. That's the most up-to-date meta-analysis based information that we currently have. So that original belief actually originally came out of a rat study. It was actually hypothesized that when you give high protein diets in rats, which are not humans, that they might see enlargement in some of these key tissues or organs. But when you actually look at humans, you don't see any signs of that. In fact, we know that protein can be an incredibly important nutrient for maintaining muscle function, mass and function. And so the evidence doesn't show that. Now, there is some evidence in pediatric literature in seizures where they did a very, very high fat form of a ketogenic diet, which is not a high protein diet. It was actually a very high fat diet. And they did see some indications of kidney stones, but they were able to provide potassium, I believe it was potassium citrate, and completely eliminate that effect. So to your original question, the most emergent evidence we currently have says that high protein diets do not cause kidney damage.
All right, now, this absolutely.
Ha! All right, yeah.
Sorry, guys, you can catch up with Andrew. I know he'll put his information up for you.
Yeah, you can, andrewkoutnik.com. I have a ton of free resources for people who are interested.
I have the most unrigorous question to ask based on what's been said before. I probably should be asking it privately. I was very active athletically in high school, and that declined slowly until by the time I finished my postdoc, I was sedentary and eventually became a desk jockey for years. I was, a few years ago, quite obese and became concerned. And I had read on the NIH website, and I think it was not PubMed, but the actual NIH advisory, that intermittent fasting had been shown to activate a different metabolism system than was active when you didn't fast. So I undertook a 12-hour fast from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for a year, and I lost 70 pounds.
Good for you.
And I had no change in my diet to speak of, except that from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. I was no longer binging on pizzas and cookies.
That probably helped, yeah.
How do you, yeah. So given the total lack of control, since the only thing I was measuring was weight loss and survivorship, and had no impact on reducing depression, and I didn't measure anything else, how would you relate that observation, or crude observation, to your findings? And especially, can you comment on my belief that intermittent fasting activates a different metabolic pathway?
It's actually a more complex question than it's actually quite complex. So there is data on intermittent fasting. A lot of it originally started, I'll start with that part first. It started in animals, and they were able to show that just by switching the time clock windows that it did actually appear to have additional benefits that were beyond just the calories alone on overall metabolic health. However, in humans, they have yet to replicate that same phenomenon. However, what seems pretty clear is that when individuals are able to do what you did, which is not eat for certain windows of time, that inadvertently they're able to dramatically reduce certain foods they're consuming that may have made it more difficult barriers to achieving their weight loss goal. And so that certainly is an effect, because we know that there's, even within the literature that illustrates there might not be, the literature in humans essentially says that it's still calorie dependent, that it's not weight loss independent. The effects of intermittent fasting, if they're positive, are usually dependent on some type of weight loss effect. But the animal data is a little bit different. Now, the question is, why would that be? Well, there's an appreciation that animals have a much faster metabolism. So I'm just speaking out of my own belief here, and other people who've shared their beliefs as well, so it's not just my own thought. But because they have a faster metabolism, if you're showing a 12-hour window on and off for an animal, that might not be a 12-hour window. That might replicate something like a multi-day fast in humans. The degree in which it reduces insulin, increases fat oxidation and ketone levels, Because in humans, you would barely see a blip at 18 hours of ketones going up. Whereas in animals, you might see a much different and more potent effect depending on how fast their metabolism is. And so I think that that's a meaningful effect because as Angela was talking about earlier, some of the other effects like epigenetic and beyond, we know that things like ketone bodies being elevated change things like epigenetics, they change metabolism, they change inflammation, oxidative stress. And so if those are meaningfully elevated, then that could have an extremely powerful effect. So there's a lot of interactive variables at play here. But I'll just want to say congratulations. I don't think people appreciate, so just for everyone in the audience, to see that degree of weight loss, you would expect that less than 5% of all people would ever achieve it or maintain it. So you should be incredibly proud of your achievement. Yeah.
So I've seen a couple people videoing the lecture, which is fine. We have no problem with that. But just so y'all know, you can go onto our website. We have an entire archive of every lecture that's ever been held in Ocala or Pensacola. So any topic that you can imagine for the last, 15, 20 years is on the website. So just so you know. And usually the lectures go up about a month after the lecture. So we thank you guys. Thank you, Andrew. And we will see you next month. We'll look forward to having you with us next month. Thanks.